Tonight we're going to begin testimony with Norman Birnbaum, who is responsible for the marijuana program through the Department of Business Regulation. Welcome and thank you for your attendance this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee for having me here today. I'll try to be brief. Article 14 of the FY17 budget saw a tremendous shift in our medical marijuana program and our ability to regulate the program. We replaced hundreds and hundreds of unregulated personal and home grows, which were then supplying a significant portion of our compassion centers with unregulated medicine that wasn't subject to child-resistant packaging, tamper-evident packaging, proper labels, proper advertisements, proper sanitation, manufacturing processes. We replaced that with new commercial and well-regulated cultivators. We've seen a tremendous amount of success here. 50% of all medicine that's sold out of 2 of the 3 compassion centers in the last year came from our cultivators, and our cultivators are now able to produce a substantial amount of medicine that's currently being demanded by patients in the program. The issue that we face is that the majority of the program is still being supplied by these personal grows, these home grows that aren't subject to these regulations and this oversight. With 60,000 plus plants in people's homes and in unregulated facilities, and only 10,000 through our regulated licensees, the administration's goal is to shift that. We want to make sure that the majority of medicine that's out there is safe, is tested through our partners at the Department of Health, is properly labeled, and is traceable, so if it ever does fall into the wrong hands, we have proper regulatory recourse. The disconnect that we have right now between the supply chain that we've built and the demand that exists is the lack of distribution. You just heard about where we stand compared to the rest of the nation when it comes to dispensaries in the state. There were less than 2,000 patients in the program when the legislature allowed 3 dispensaries back in 2009. We're now over 19,000 patients and we still have the same number of dispensaries. We have 4 times the patient per dispensary ratio that our colleagues do in similar markets. And so there's a question of how do we address the continuing black market that we see out there in the unregulated market by allowing people greater access and accessibility to additional methods of distribution. Creating additional compassion centers will also create additional competition in the market. It will allow there to be additional forms and varieties of medical marijuana, of which there are hundreds of different strains and different products. And so the more that it's available and the more competition that there is, the less people will feel the need to obtain it from the black market or to grow it or appoint someone to grow it in what could be hazardous conditions. This is all to create additional and more accountability within the less regulated personal and home grow market and make sure that we can continue the great success that we've seen in the last year and a half. With that, thank you for hearing me today. I think we're all welcome to take any questions.
Oh, thank you for your testimony. So questions from the committee. Senator Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few questions, Jonathan, Dr. Scott, and Norman. Thank you very much. So we talked about the number of compassion centers in comparison to other states. So while that's a good comparison to have, and I'll say I'm familiar with one of the compassion centers, driving by it, and I work next to it and have since it opened. Do we know that we need more, or we're saying we need more because our numbers are not in line with other states? So I'd like to, maybe when somebody comes up later, maybe one of the owners of the compassion center saying, we can't service any more people. We're chock-a-block full. How did the number come about? As opposed, was it just looking at other states, or we're saying the patients that need the medicine can't get it because they're oversubscribed at the compassion centers, putting manufacturing aside?
I think it was a combination of looking at where we are when matched with the national benchmark and surrounding markets, but also looking at the data that we've been able to obtain now about the production of marijuana in the state and looking at the ratio of what's being produced in people's homes through patient and caregiver grows. The ratio there is about the same. We're at about 6-to-1 in production outside of these licensed facilities to inside these facilities, and we're about 4-to-1 in terms of where we're lacking behind other.
So no, I'm not picking at the number with regards to the 60,000 to 10,000 or whatever. Mm-hmm. I'm picking at, we're moving forward with the manufacturing license. That's different than where it's being produced. If the compassion centers is a bottleneck, that's one issue. Setting aside the manufacturing piece separately, but if the compassion centers are not a bottleneck, then I'm not sure if I've heard that I think we need to see the justification for why more than 3.
So with all due respect, Senator, I think what Norm was trying to say is the relationship between the 60,000 and the 10,000.
Right.
So it's not just a bottleneck issue. It's the administration's proposal is an affirmative policy shift to move more production, and because on the caregiver side, it's not just production, right? It's production and use, right, from the caregiver to the compassion center market. That we think that having a more regulated market there is important.
Is the question around manufacturing licenses and why those are also being introduced?
No.
Okay.
And I'll stop here, but if the issue is a bottleneck of compassionate centers, then we need more. If the root cause of the issue we're trying to address is so many plants are being kept by individual caregivers or patients, you potentially address that by having manufacturers that supply compassion centers, if that's in fact the case. But maybe I'll take it offline. I don't want to take any more time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Chacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor.
So if I'm one of the 19,000 cardholders, I basically have 2 options. I can go to the compassion center to receive my dosage, or I could, I don't know how to say, develop a relationship with a caregiver to grow and get the plants marijuana through that individual, correct?
Or you could grow yourself as well, or you could or you could appoint someone who's called an authorized purchaser to purchase on your behalf if you were homebound or there was a mobility issue.
All right, so then how many relationships do we have between the patient and the caregiver that don't utilize the compassion center?
How many caregivers are out there that don't work through the compassion centers?
Correct.
I think currently
Back to the question of, you're saying that you have 2,000 caregivers. How many do they service? How many patients can they service?
Senator, so we do have empirical data around, I think, what you're talking about with the caregiver ratio based on availability and accessibility through compassion centers. So before Article 14, 2 years ago, a patient used to have to be registered with a compassion center, so they really could only either shop at 1 or 2. What Article 14 did was it allowed them to no longer need to be registered. They weren't limited. They could now shop at all 3 without going through the registration process. So that made, in the existing market, compassion centers much more available. People could shop at all 3 of them. They were able to more adequately compete with each other. Prices lowered. Their count of steady customers and active customers all went up. And what we saw is this decrease that we spoke about before, which showed that we had 3,600 caregivers before they were able to shop at all 3, and now we're at around 2,000, just over 2,000. So we've already...
I mean, that's the point I'm trying to get at, is the regulation aspect that's required of those 2,000 caregivers, and how many patients do they have, or maximum they can have?
So that number is not the individual people, but is the registrations. So if you're talking about actual people, we're talking more along the lines of 1,700 or so people. The majority of caregivers only provide for 1 patient. The next largest number provides for 2 patients, and then 3 patients, and 4 patients, and 5 patients, so on. We can definitely follow up with that information and the current data related to those relationships.
Okay, and my last 2 series of questions are relative to the cultivators, because the cultivators are the ones that supply the compassion centers. And do we have a limit of the cultivators, or do we allow anyone to be a cultivator once they get certified by DBR?
So there was an application period that was open and is now closed. DBR is not receiving any additional applications right now because we want the market to settle. and we want to be able to take an approach where we can do some market analysis and see what's happening, and also we don't want the production to surpass the distribution, which is what we're looking at right now in terms of where it's being supplied from, how it can be distributed. So we currently have 23 cultivators who are licensed, eligible to have plants in the facilities, and are conducting business with our compassion centers. As I mentioned before, 2 of the compassion centers sold about 50% of everything through their shops from our existing compassion centers. One of them, it was only about 10%. We have another 40 or so that have been approved that are going through the licensing process, and we have another 40 or so that are behind that are going through the application process.
So you're saying there's 23?
23 that are licensed today.
And I guess my last question would be relative to the expansion from the 3 to the 15. Are we ensuring that we're geographic in terms of the whole state, so an individual doesn't have to travel 40, 50 miles to arrive at a compassion center?
The language contained in the article specifies that one of the licensing requirements will be based off accessibility for underserved areas in the state. So one of the issues at hand is municipal zoning, and we defer to municipalities on these licenses, but the plan is to make sure that we can look at the appropriate data from what we have, what the Department of Health has, and work together to make sure that we are placing any new compassion centers in underserved areas where they're going to do the most public good.
Senator Seveny.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't find anywhere, is there some projection on how many marijuana patients you expect to see, like in the next 3 to 5 years? I mean, there's 19,000 now out there. What's it going to be in 5 years? So within the state of Rhode Island, there's 3 of them now. One's in Portsmouth. Where are the other 2?
There's one in Warwick and one in Providence.
Okay, so from pretty much anywhere in Rhode Island, you know, a 20-minute ride gets you to one of these places where you get exactly, you know what the quality is, it's packaged properly. Okay, but, so it's a 25-minute ride.
We do hear from patients that, you know, I live 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, and I have 4 or 5 pharmacies, be they Walgreens, CVS, or you know, things of that nature within 5 or 10 minutes. And, you know, the issue with this industry, and it's really in any market that you go to, is the throughput on the product is very quick. Nothing really stays on the shelves. And so when that happens, you're dealing with agricultural crop. You come into supply shortages naturally. So one of the things that we're trying to do by expanding the number of dispensaries and expanding the distribution is making sure that patients can readily find products that will treat their condition, because you don't always find the same thing week to week or from store to store, and a lot of that is because of the frequently moving parts and some of the bottlenecking that we're talking about with limited distribution.
Yeah, but you're fixing that with by increasing and better regulating the manufacturing, right, the growers. So I'm still, so there have been complaints that people go to these compassion centers and they don't have what they want?
We hear from patients that there is not always consistent supply, and sometimes varying degrees of effectiveness. And so one of the things that we're
So the consistent supply doesn't really have anything to do with the number of places. It's consistency of supplier, right? So we're tripling, or you want to triple the number of outlets, if you will. And I'm still not understanding that there's really an issue with the 3 outlets that exist, other than you might have to drive a little further than you want. But I also read in here that a patient can go in and buy enough stuff to last like 3 weeks, a month. Is that true?
I think one of the things to contend with is that the existing dispensaries are vertically integrated to a certain extent. And when you're vertically integrated and you're growing and producing things in-house, there's inherently some profit margins there that are elevated rather than taking product from someone who's a wholesaler. So what we propose to do is to restructure this license for any additional compassion center so that they're not vertically integrated, so that it makes more financial sense because they don't have that overhead, they don't have the high cost of having to pay the monthly bill for utility for indoor growing, and they don't have the square footage and the footprint, and they can supply a greater variety of medicine that's maybe more consistent than the existing compassion centers that have much higher overhead and may have to promote some things that are made in-house, but they don't have the infrastructure in-house to produce everything that every patient needs, which is why we have patients that then grow for themselves or obtain it from the black market. So I think that's one of the important variables here.
Yeah, I still don't make the connection to the outlet itself. I mean, vertical integration is fine if you've got one place and he will only accept from one or two suppliers, but not the others. I mean, you're fixing that through this, as best I can tell. The manufacturing in the growing community and all that, and the way they're gonna be registered and certified, can, I think, from what I read, can make available whatever anybody wants at whatever outlet, whatever compassion center they want. And I would assume that between the competitive pressure between the three outlets and the demand, that whoever's running these outlets gonna find themselves, it's in their interest to get less vertically integrated if there are more registered suppliers that can get. So I'm still not understanding why we need to triple the number of these outlets around the state. I guess comparisons are interesting, but only in the face of a complaint or a limitation in the service. I mean, if people are not happy, because they can't get the stuff and there's a waiting line or there's delays, I can understand, but you're not really saying that. I didn't see that anywhere, that there's a limitation in the ability to service those 19,000 customers.
No, I think you can also see that, though, in still the fact that the black market exists. When you limit access, that, people will, generally move towards those access points to the cheapest and most convenient.
So you're suggesting that instead of driving for 20 minutes, to get to Warwick or Portsmouth or whatever,
Their neighbor,
buy it on the black market?
yeah, if their neighbor's growing it down the hall.
I also think that what you're saying makes complete sense for their existing customer base, but their existing customer base, looking at the supply and where it's coming from, is really only supplying 1/6 of everything that's being grown out there. So for their existing customer base, that might be correct. But what we're trying to do is shift these customers that aren't their customers. They're these customers that are producing plants at 6x basically, and have them come over for convenience, for safety, for a lot of different reasons, especially traceability of this product.
Or to make them, not doing something illegal, essentially, right?
Yes.
I don't know that more compassion centers really is the answer to illegal activity, but, okay, I think I'm done. I still, did you guys say how many you expect to see, like in 5 years? How many new patients, because you're allowing acute care as well as the chronic care? I mean, are we looking at doing the double? Is it gonna be?
Yeah, I mean,
Now, I'm assuming that the acute pain, when it goes away, your card goes away too, right? Right?
Yes.
Because, I mean, this is almost starting to sound like, why not just legalize it? Which is a question that's come up by some of my constituents that I don't really have an answer for.
It's a limited registration for a shorter duration of time, and also that doesn't allow someone to grow themselves or appoint a caregiver, because those are more longer-term methods of production.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. What's been our experience to date with implementing and then enforcing the tagging of the tagging program?
Sure. So DBR now has received orders for approximately 60,000 tags. A lot of those, approximately 30,000 of them have been distributed. We procured a vendor to make the system and to coordinate with existing data for verification purposes from the Department of Health, and we're able to have that up online and available by the statutory deadline that was given to us in Article 14. So that was a January 3rd order date after the budget passed. I believe it was the first week of July previous.
Okay, thank you. Senator Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to ask some specific questions, but I'm just going to make a more general one. You've been morphing the approach for the last 8 years, since 2010, or 2009, I guess. It's come into existence. We made some changes last year. There were some changes that were proposed that didn't go forward. I was going to ask the question with regards to we're going from 12 plants to 8 plants, or 24 plants to 16 plants, and the like. Potentially 3 compassion centers to 15, so we're going to quadrupling the number, or 5 times the number we have today. And if I think about what we're setting up is similar to granted, this is a medicinal product, the alcohol industry, where we have manufacturers, distributors, and retailers, and we're setting up something similar. And I think that system sort of came about. It wasn't around when it first started, obviously, none of us were, but the system just evolved. The concern with what we have here is, without a strategic plan of what this needs to look like 5 years from now, or 7 years from now, and pulling the thread from Senator 70 with regards to, we're going on the slippery slope of legalizing it. We just are. With regards to the path we're going down, we are going down that slippery slope. But if we took a step back, and put that aside, I won't say that again, but even from the medicinal side, without having a 5 or 7 year strategic plan that says, this is what we think what it's going to look like. We need to have N number of compassion centers because, we need to have Y number of cultivators because, we need to have Z number of manufacturers because, R number of caregivers because, all driven by a number of patients. Because I think with regards to what we're doing on the acute pain piece, and there's, in the legislation, so I think it's 6 months you can have it for, and as you said, Norm, you can't grow it, you can't do whatever. We don't know what that number is going to be. We have an estimate what it's going to be. I'm not sure if other states have it, and if they do, they haven't been doing it long enough. So I think the recommendation here is we put a pause on what we have, put the plan together, because we're really don't run on the slippery slope of we're going to do what we think is right, because the facts and data are telling us that. But it's only we're taking a snapshot of the picture today, and the game's going to go on for 9 more innings. So I think that's a concern I have, is that we're making these incremental, important but incremental changes, but without looking at it in a wholesale where we ultimately need to go, we're going to end up somewhere where we don't really know what that is because of how things might change over time. Just a concern. Thank you.
Senator Felag.
Getting back to the number of patient caregivers, because to me that seems like a big part of DBR's work in terms of trying to monitor these 1,700. Can you step me through the process of monitoring that patient caregivers such that that relationship exists, and how do we monitor the strain of the marijuana that's being grown for each of the patients?
Sure. So we do not have proactive inspections. I want to make sure everyone understands that. There are very strong patient privacy protections in the law. It protects a patient or caregiver from search and seizure based on their status in the program alone. We have these tags in place and subsequent regulations over how they have to be used, so that if someone brings to our attention that they suspect our regulations are being violated, we can then go in after the fact. But there's very strong language in here that protects people's status in the program that we don't have the ability, nor do we want to infringe upon. So I think the question that we have is, it would be very, very difficult to try to proactively inspect 19,000 people across the state, or 2,000 people across the state that are growing. This is something that a lot of municipalities are grappling with right now, and there's some ongoing cases in Superior Court around how they're addressing this. So we're taking a market-based approach to this in terms of supply, demand, availability, and distribution, which we've already seen in terms of the decrease in caregivers over the last year and a half, and that we believe we will continue to see, because as we talk about this throughout the state, I think it's a question of a choice. Do we want dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of patients and caregivers who are potentially growing in homes or storage units that aren't subject to proactive inspections by us or building code? You know, there are significant issues with public health and public safety when it comes to the HVAC that's
Excuse me,
involved. in
I'm
the
sorry to
electrical.
interrupt, but
Sure.
I want you to pick up right where you left off just a moment. But I'm going to ask everybody in attendance to respect the people who are testifying. Others will respect your testimony when you come before the committee. So we're going to ask you to do that during others' testimony as well. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. So do we want dozens or hundreds of these grows that pose significant potential threats to public health and public safety? Or do we want a fewer amount of highly regulated facilities that are licensed where we can log in at our desk and see their entire security camera and see all system in every square foot where marijuana is stored, produced, manufactured, or grown? They have to get approval from local zoning. They need to be inspected by their building inspector. They need to be inspected by the state fire marshal. And there's a balance here. We need to increase access if we're going to then address the issue I think you're speaking to, which is the number of grows out there that we don't have the ability to, nor the resources to do proactive inspections on.
I guess my next question is relative to the compassion centers themselves. If I walk into one of the compassion centers, how many options do I have in terms of the marijuana product and its strength?
So typically dozens. Marijuana strength is typically measured in milligrams of THC. The other main component is CBD, and that has strong, potentially medicinal properties. But the key here is there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different strains of marijuana, different strains with different ratios of CBD to THC to CBN to CBA, and all these different things that interact with our endocannabinoid system. And for every different strain, there's a different product. So for some person, it might be a topical cream. For another, it might be something that they vape, something that they inhale, something that they ingest as a tincture, something that they ingest as a gummy. So, you know, you could go in and see potentially dozens and dozens of different products that are actually only being produced from the distillate or the extract of 2 or 3 strains that are there. So this is one of the, and they only have so much shelf space, and again, there's the issue of a very large and expensive overhead and their vertical integration. So this is another reason why we believe that we need additional compassion centers that go along with a restructuring of the license, so it's really just to distribute.
So my last comment would be relative to the strength. The strength would be relative to whatever is selling to the majority, because the cultivators are producing that particular strain of marijuana, whereas the option of individuals to purchase their own gives them that flexibility in terms of if they develop a relationship with a caregiver that has a certain strain that works well for their particular condition, then, you know, that relationship can still exist.
Yes.
I just want to make sure we're not taking them out of the loop by having these so many compassion centers that that option is not available to them.
The article absolutely preserves the patient and caregiver relationship here. It actually also allows us to obtain additional information in terms of caregivers that want to provide for 2, 3, 4, or 5 patients and have much larger grows where there's, you know, the potential for some issues to arrive, for us to understand exactly why this caregiver is needed to supply many patients, whether that's because they grow a specific strain or they make a specific product for a specific group of patients with maybe the same qualifying condition, things like that. So this will allow us to preserve that and obtain more data around it.
Okay.
When we talk about all the different strains, the different products, the different needs that the patients have, do we have any medicinal standards in place that we apply to the, to all of the, to those broad range of characteristics?
That's a great question. It's something.
You answered a question for Senator Felag, in kind of his first round of questioning about the number of cultivators that you've licensed to date. How does that project for being able to supply the expansion in the compassion centers?
And so we're very confident that the existing cultivators that we've licensed and then those that are in the pipeline will be able to supply additional compassion centers. Right now, I would say there's a little bit of a gap between what they're producing and then what the compassion centers are able to distribute, which is another reason why we're proposing an expansion.
Do we know anything about the profit margin of the compassion centers?
Yes, we see purchase orders, we see sale prices, and then compassion centers pay a monthly 4% surcharge, which is to the state, which is 4% of their net patient revenue that they collect each month.
So what is that information telling us about their profit margin?
I don't want to get into anything that could be protected tax information.
I'm not asking you what they're
Oh.
getting taxed. I'm not asking you for any confidential information.
Sure.
I'm asking you based on the information that you just shared with us, what does that tell us about the profit margins for the compassion centers?
So the products that they sell have a margin of anywhere from 100% typically to 400%. 100% for the lower, 100%, the average wholesale price of marijuana from our cultivators right now per gram is about between $4.06, around $4.06. If you go on their website, you will see their lower end strains sell anywhere from $7 to $9 a gram, and their higher end strains sell anywhere from $16 to $20 a gram. But one thing to understand is that it's very difficult to get financing for these businesses because of the federal stance. They do not enjoy the same tax deductions as typical businesses, and there are many issues with 280E, which I'm sure they'll tell you about. There are some in the room here. So right now, there's a little bit of a disconnect potentially between the amount of profit that they're making and whether or not they're in the black or in the red.
Got it. Thank you. Senator Seveny.
So I thought I understood what a caregiver was compared to the compassion center, but, you know, that's fading somewhat as this conversation goes on. Other than the fact that a caregiver only has so many folks that they can service, what's the difference between a caregiver and the compassion center? Is that where the business takes place between the patient and the caregiver?
A caregiver is registered with anywhere from 1 to 5 patients through the Department of Health. They are registered and they have the protections to grow or manufacture marijuana for those patients that they're registered with, and they can receive reimbursement for that. Whereas the compassion centers are large-scale facilities. So I would liken it from someone who is a craft brewer who can only distribute, or a home brewer, so to speak, who can only distribute what they brew in their, say, garage to a handful of people with a registration, as opposed to a liquor store, which also is a distillery or a brewery.
So a caregiver is a mini compassion center, essentially. A patient that's registered with that caregiver goes to the caregiver, pays money, gets the marijuana that.
With far less regulation.
Well,
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd also add that it's also a very unique aspect to Rhode Island. I mean, if you look at other states.
So this goes back to Senator De Palma's question on strategic aims. Do we want more caregivers or less? And as the number of compassion centers increases, are the number of individual caregivers going to decrease, or should they decrease?
That's what we've seen over the last year and a half.
What do we want?
Yeah, I think what we want is medicine to be tested. I think we want medicine to be in child-resistant packaging, and nothing that's produced by a caregiver
And the
does that.
caregivers don't have access to the labs, right? So
Correct.
their stuff isn't getting,
Excuse me,
yeah, you get your turn, okay? So the caregivers, whatever they're doing, doesn't go through the lab. And the packaging might be an issue or whatever. Okay. So it seems to me then that the aim of the increased compassion centers is to reduce the unregulated or less regulated sources of supply on a more individual basis. Okay. Now that starts to make a little more sense, but how are you gonna make that happen? I didn't see anything that says, are you going to limit the individual caregiver licenses that you issue?
Yeah, so the article proposes additional limits on caregivers. Right now, there are no restrictions for a caregiver, whether they provide for one patient or for 5 patients. What we propose is to establish a 1-to-1 ratio that you see commonly in other states, with an allowance for a caregiver to provide for additional patients if they're either a family member or there's a demonstration of need. We also propose a limitation in the number of plant counts. One of the things that we've heard from stakeholders throughout the program is that there's a disparity between the number of plants that someone can possess and the amount of usable marijuana that they can yield. So to create more accountability and to help with regulation, we have proposed a decrease in the plant counts of 25% and then an increase of the amount that you can possess by 20%.
And this is just for the caregivers,
This is for caregivers and any patient that also grows for themselves.
grows their own, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Chacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To make it a little bit clearer, in order to protect the users, we'll put it this way here, in order to protect the users who are buying it, we want to cut back on the caregivers who are growing based on, what is it, 7 plants for each?
12 mature plants and 12 immature plants.
All right, so right now, we have no way of knowing if they are growing the number that they are appropriated to grow, because we can't check every single caregiver that's out there, correct?
They purchase the tags, which is what we use, but unless someone were to give us information, it's very possible that caregivers who purchase 12 tags actually are growing 30 plants or more.
Right, so therefore, the tax on the excess is not being paid, and also, it could be sold on the street, the excess.
That's correct.
Correct? This would try to prevent what's taking place and put more controls under it, so we understand exactly how many plants are out there, what the strain is, and try to regulate the cost so everyone has an affordable market, and to cut the black market sale of it, correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
And I'll add, our focus continues to be
Okay, so it's Master Connecticut. Just it's interesting that that's not changing what, if there was some different behavior we're trying to change. I don't know what that behavior is, of Rhode Island residents being prescribed by Connecticut or Mass into Rhode Island, and we're trying to change that behavior, saying, no, you can only do it in Rhode Island. There must be a reason we're doing it. Well, for allowing Massachusetts folks to come in and Connecticut folks to come in to be prescribed by those folks that we were trying to have the folks from Mass to Connecticut not be prescribed by, those folks are coming back in. Am I missing that piece? That's my last question.
we would still have oversight over the Rhode Island physicians who are authorizing.
But not the Massachusetts ones with which you had a problem with today.
So there are a few issues here. One is that because of the reciprocity for you to possess and to use from out of state anywhere, it's not just Massachusetts and Connecticut, those populations can come in here and then they purchase in our black market. They have homes here, they vacation here, they work here, and they can't obtain it through our compassion centers, so they're obtaining it through caregivers in the black market. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is, as Dr. Scott mentioned, is a regulatory issue, because if someone in Massachusetts is issued a card by a Massachusetts doctor, that doctor is doing so in accordance with Massachusetts law and rules and regulations, and so there's a check and balance there. What we're eliminating is them to be able to do that for Rhode Island residents under the Departments of Health rules and regulations when they can't take action.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm all set.
Thank you. Senator Felag.
We've spoken about two sections here. We've spoken about the patient caregivers and their obligations and their responsibilities to their patients. We've talked about the compassion centers. The other aspect I want to get a little more in depth on would be the cultivators. We say there's 23 cultivators now, was that correct?
That's correct.
And are we looking to expand the number of cultivators?
Not past the applications that we received in this last period.
And how many were those?
In total, there were 117.
Do you know, because I think the problem I have right now is that, is there a yearly fee for these cultivators?
Yes, there is.
And what does that amount?
It depends on the size of the facility and the class of their license. For licenses that we're issuing now, it's either $5,000, $20,000, or $35,000.
So 5, 20, or 35, you said?
Yes.
Now, that's a sizable investment for these individuals, because I'm sure that they don't grow this outside, so they're growing it within some kind of building, correct?
Yes.
And obviously, there's going to be electrical cost and heating cost and all the other costs that are associated with them. Are we throwing them under the bus by expanding and now saying, all of a sudden, we're going to go from 23 to potentially 100 or more of these cultivators after we've established a relationship with them to produce to these 3 compassion centers?
So I think that's a key component as to why the administration is requesting and proposing an expansion in compassion centers, so they have more than 3 people to sell to. This is a pretty valuable crop. It's selling right now anywhere from $1,500 a pound to $2,100 or $2,200 a pound. In these robust facilities where they're very good at growing, they may have 100 plants inside that they're yielding 2 pounds each. So 200 pounds of harvest, 4 harvests a year, 800 pounds that's 800 pounds for the year at $2,000. It's a sizable amount of money that they have the ability to make if we can make the distribution match the supply that we're putting in place, which certainly the demand is there when you look at the amount of plants that we have in the unregulated side of the market.
Potentially, those particular licensed cultivators could go under because of the fact that there's that much more competition for those compassion centers and selling their product to them.
Certainly with only 3 to sell to now, yes.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the committee? Well, thank you all very much for your testimony. Provided a lot of important information to us, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
We're going to go on to